In a sun-drenched Phoenix suburb, 72-year-old retired mechanic Frank Martinez was about to hear words that would ignite a fire he thought had long since burned out. What started as a simple request to borrow his truck for a weekend camping trip would explode into a battle over dignity, respect, and the dangerous assumptions we make about aging. Frank wasn't your typical grandfather being pushed aside. For 45 years, he'd built engines with his bare hands, trained apprentices half his age, and never met a machine he couldn't fix. When his son Michael waved those car keys like a weapon of surrender, he had no idea he was challenging a man who still had plenty of fight left in him. What began as family humiliation would become one grandfather's crusade for respect through an unexpected confrontation that would shake his son's world to its core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona heat shimmered off the driveway pavement as Frank Martinez wiped grease from his hands with the same red shop rag he'd carried for 20 years. At 72, his movements were more deliberate than they'd once been, but his weathered hands still held the steady confidence of a man who'd spent 5 decades coaxing life from dead engines. The 1995 Ford F-150 sitting in his garage wasn't just transportation. It was proof that some things, when properly maintained, only got better with age. Frank had been under the hood since sunrise, replacing the alternator on Mrs. Patterson's sedan from down the street. Word had spread through the neighborhood that the old mechanic still took on small jobs, and his modest garage had become a refuge for neighbors who couldn't afford dealership prices. The work kept his hands busy, and his mind sharp, two things that had become increasingly important since his wife Eleanor's passing 3 years ago. The sound of tires on gravel announced Michael's arrival before Frank saw the sleek BMW pulling into the driveway. His 45-year-old son emerged from the air-conditioned comfort of his car, his insurance company polo shirt crisp, despite the desert heat. Michael had always been particular about his appearance, a trait that had served him well in his career but had driven a quiet wedge between father and son over the years. "Hey, Pop," Michael called, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness that had replaced genuine warmth somewhere along the way. "Working on another neighbor's car, I see." Frank nodded, not looking up from the engine bay. "Mrs. Patterson's alternator gave out. Simple fix." He gestured toward the old woman's sedan with obvious satisfaction. "She'll have it back this afternoon, running better than it has in years." Michael glanced around the garage, taking in the organized chaos of tools, parts, and half-finished projects that had been Frank's domain for as long as he could remember. There was something in his expression, a mixture of nostalgia and concern that Frank had learned to recognize and dread. "Dad, we need to talk." The words hung in the desert air like heat lightning, charged with implications. Frank finally straightened, his back protesting the hours he'd spent bent over the engine. At 72, he was still tall and broad-shouldered, his frame carrying the kind of strength that came from a lifetime of physical work rather than gym memberships. "What's on your mind, son?" Michael shifted uncomfortably, his polished shoes scraping against the concrete floor. "It's about this weekend, the camping trip with the kids. I was wondering if maybe we could take my car instead of your truck." Frank's eyebrows rose slightly. Michael's BMW was beautiful, certainly, but it had all the camping utility of a yacht and a swimming pool. "Your car? To haul camping gear for 6 people across rough terrain? Well, we could rent something. An SUV or—" Michael's voice trailed off as he caught sight of Frank's expression. "Michael, I've been driving that truck for 15 years. It's never let me down once, and it sure as hell knows its way around the backwoods better than any rental." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the distant hum of the air conditioning unit. Mrs. Patterson had insisted Frank install in his garage after Eleanor's funeral. She'd said it wasn't right for a man his age to work in such heat, but Frank suspected it was really about giving him fewer reasons to avoid the work that kept his grief at bay. "Dad," Michael said finally, his voice taking on the patient tone he probably used with difficult insurance clients, "it's not about the truck. It's about safety." The word landed like a wrench dropped on concrete, sharp and final. Frank set down the socket wrench he'd been holding and turned to face his son completely. "Safety? You're 72 years old, Dad. Your reflexes aren't what they used to be. Hell, last month you forgot where you parked at the grocery store. What if something happens on those mountain roads? What if you have one of those senior moments while you're driving my kids? Frank felt something cold settle in his chest, a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Senior moments? Michael pressed on, apparently mistaking his father's quiet tone for consideration. Look, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings. But driving is a young man's game, especially in challenging conditions. Those mountain roads, the night driving coming back, it's just not worth the risk anymore. The garage fell silent, except for the rhythmic tick of cooling metal from Mrs. Patterson's engine. Frank stared at his son, this man he'd raised, taught to change oil, shown how to check tire pressure, and jump-start a dead battery. This son who had called him from college at 2 a.m. when his first car broke down, confident that Dad would know exactly what to do. "You think I'm too old to drive," Frank said quietly. "I think you're too old to drive safely in challenging conditions with precious cargo," Michael corrected, as if the distinction mattered. "Dad, this isn't personal. It's just reality. At your age, accidents happen. Reaction times slow down. You can't see as well at night. It's not your fault. It's just biology." Frank walked slowly to his workbench, his movements careful and controlled. He picked up a timing light, an expensive piece of equipment he'd bought new in 1987 and maintained with religious precision ever since. The tool had diagnosed thousands of engine problems over the decades, its beam revealing the precise moment when pistons fired and valves opened. "This timing light," he said, his voice conversational, "is older than your oldest daughter. But it's still the most accurate diagnostic tool I own. You know why?" Michael looked confused by the apparent change of subject. "Dad, I don't see what." "Because I've taken care of it. Because I understand how it works. Because experience and knowledge matter more than age when you're dealing with precision instruments." Frank set the timing light down gently. "A car engine is a precision instrument, Michael. So is a 72-year-old man who's been driving for 56 years without a single at-fault accident. That's different, and you know it." "Is it?" Frank's voice hardened slightly. "Let me ask you something, son. When was the last time you changed your own oil? Replaced your brake pads? Hell, when was the last time you checked your tire pressure?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I have people for that, Dad. Professionals." "Professionals," Frank repeated. "Like the ones at that fancy dealership who told Mrs. Patterson she needed a new transmission when all she needed was a $50 alternator? Like the ones who wanted to charge you $800 for a brake job I could do for $200? That's not the point. That is exactly the point." Frank's voice carried the authority of 4.5 decades of automotive expertise. "You trust strangers with machines worth more than most people's houses, but you don't trust your own father to drive his truck on roads he's been traveling since before you were born." Michael's face flushed, the careful composure he'd cultivated for his professional life beginning to crack. "Dad, this isn't about trust. It's about accepting limitations. Everyone gets older. Everyone has to make adjustments." "Adjustments?" Frank said the word like it tasted bitter. "Like moving into one of those retirement communities where they drive you around in a van like a child? Like giving up everything that makes you who you are because someone decided you're past your expiration date?" "Nobody's talking about retirement homes, Dad. We're talking about one camping trip. One weekend where maybe, just maybe, it would be safer if someone else drove." Frank studied his son's face, searching for some trace of the boy who used to sit on an overturned crate in this very garage, asking endless questions about carburetors and transmissions. The boy who'd been so proud when Frank finally let him hold the flashlight during a late-night repair job. "Someone else," Frank repeated. "You mean someone younger? Someone who hasn't forgotten where he parked once in 30 years of shopping at the same grocery store. Someone who doesn't qualify for senior discounts or need reading glasses to see the fine print on insurance forms." The mention of insurance forms hit home. Michael's slight flinch was almost imperceptible, but Frank caught it. He'd spent a lifetime reading the subtle signs of mechanical failure, and reading people wasn't so different. "This is about your job, isn't it?" Frank's voice was quiet now, dangerous. about what your colleagues think when they hear you're letting your elderly father drive your family around. That's not. Michael started, then stopped. His silence was answer enough. Frank nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. How long have you been planning this conversation, son? How many nights did you lie awake wondering how to tell your old man he's too decrepit to be trusted behind the wheel? Dad, please, you're making this harder than it needs to be. Am I, or am I just refusing to make it easy for you to push me aside? Frank picked up his keys from the workbench, the familiar weight of them solid and reassuring in his palm. These keys represent 56 years of safe driving, Michael. No DUIs, no reckless driving tickets, no accidents that were my fault. My insurance rates are lower than yours, and my last DMV test scores were higher than the state average for drivers your age. Michael's mouth opened, then closed. Frank could see him processing this information, trying to reconcile it with the narrative he'd constructed about his aging father's declining capabilities. You want to know what I think? Frank continued, his voice gaining strength. I think you're embarrassed. I think you're tired of explaining to your insurance executive friends why your father still drives himself around instead of gracefully accepting his golden years in some sanitized retirement community. The accusation hung between them like smoke from an overheated engine. Michael's face cycled through anger, shame, and defensive indignation before settling on something that looked disturbingly like relief, as if being accused of ulterior motives was easier than admitting to genuine concern. Maybe you're right, Michael said finally. Maybe this is about more than just driving. Maybe it's about the fact that you're getting older whether you want to admit it or not, and somebody has to be the adult here. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Somebody has to be the adult here. As if 72 years of life, 45 years of marriage, decades of responsible parenthood, and a successful career didn't qualify him for adult status anymore. Frank looked around his garage one more time, at the tools he'd collected over 5 decades, at Mrs. Patterson's sedan waiting for its owner to return, at the workbench where he'd taught his son to change spark plugs and adjust carburetors. All of it suddenly felt like evidence in a case against his own competence. Get out, he said quietly. Dad, get out of my garage, Michael. Frank's voice was steady, controlled, but carried an edge that made his son take a step backward. Take your concerns about my capabilities and your embarrassment about my age and get out. Michael hesitated, clearly torn between retreat and the desire to press his point. This conversation isn't over, Dad. We still need to figure out transportation for this weekend. Frank walked to the garage door opener and pressed the button. The motor hummed to life, raising the door to let in the blazing Arizona afternoon. Heat rolled into the garage like a wave, but it felt good against Frank's skin, real and immediate and alive. The conversation is over, he said without turning around. And so is the camping trip. Find someone else to disappoint with your assumptions about age and capability. He heard Michael's footsteps on the concrete, then the sound of the BMW's engine starting. As his son's car disappeared down the street, Frank stood alone in his garage, surrounded by the tools and machines that had defined his adult life. For the first time in 3 years, the space felt less like a refuge and more like a prison, a place where an old man puttered around with other people's problems because his own son had decided he was too decrepit to handle his own. But as Frank looked at his truck keys, still solid and familiar in his weathered hand, a different kind of engine began turning over in his mind. Michael thought he was too old to drive safely? Too much of a liability to be trusted with precious cargo? Frank Martinez smiled grimly as he walked toward his perfectly maintained F-150. It was time to take that theory for a test drive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Phoenix Public Library's computer lab hummed with the quiet efficiency of a place where information lived and breathed. Frank Martinez sat at Terminal 7, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he navigated through screens with the methodical precision he'd once applied to engine diagnostics. 3 days had passed since Michael's devastating dismissal, and Frank had spent every waking hour preparing for what he'd come to think of as his counteroffensive. His notebook, the same spiral-bound kind he'd used for work orders at the shop, lay open beside the keyboard, filled with neat handwriting that would have surprised his son. phone numbers, addresses, insurance regulations, and most importantly, the organizational chart of Pinnacle Insurance Group, Michael's employer. Frank had always been a researcher. Eleanor used to joke that he couldn't buy a toaster without reading every consumer report published in the last 5 years. That trait had served him well in his automotive career. He'd built a reputation for diagnosing problems other mechanics missed because he took the time to understand not just how things worked, but why they sometimes didn't. Now he was applying that same systematic approach to understanding his son's world, and what he'd discovered made his jaw clench with righteous anger. "Excuse me?" A soft voice interrupted his concentration. Frank looked up to see a woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, standing beside his terminal with a confused expression. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I can't seem to get this computer to print my resume. The lady at the desk said someone over here might be able to help." Frank studied her for a moment. Helen Garrett, according to the name tag she wore from some temporary employment agency. Her clothes were professional but worn, her shoes practical rather than fashionable. She had the look of someone trying to re-enter the workforce after years away, fighting the same assumptions about age that Frank was grappling with. "Sure thing," Frank said, rising from his chair. "What seems to be the problem?" 10 minutes later, Helen's resume was printing, and Frank had gained an unlikely ally. As it turned out, Helen was a retired executive secretary who'd spent 30 years managing the schedules and correspondence of high-level insurance executives. Her husband's medical bills had eaten through their retirement savings, forcing her back into the job market at 64. "The worst part," she said, watching her resume emerge from the printer, "isn't that they won't hire me. It's the way they look at me. Like I'm already dead but just haven't figured it out yet." Frank nodded grimly. "My son thinks I'm too old to drive safely. Says my reflexes are shot, my night vision's gone, and I'm a danger to his precious children." Helen's eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of driving record do you have?" "Spotless. 56 years, no at-fault accidents, current on all my certifications. Even took a defensive driving course last year to keep my insurance rates low." Frank's voice carried the pride of a professional presenting his credentials. "And your son?" Frank pulled out his phone, scrolling through the photos until he found what he was looking for. 3 tickets in the last 2 years, including one for texting while driving. Had a fender bender in a parking garage 6 months ago. His fault, but somehow I'm the dangerous one. Helen smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "You know what your son does for a living? Insurance. Middle management at some big company. Why?" "Because I know that industry, and I know the pressures those managers face. Everything's about liability assessment, risk management, and covering your assets. Your son isn't seeing you as his father. He's seeing you as a potential liability that could affect his professional reputation." The words hit Frank like a punch to the gut, confirming suspicions he'd been trying to ignore. "You really think that's what this is about?" "I think your son works in an industry that teaches people to view everyone over 65 as a walking insurance claim waiting to happen. I think he's internalized those attitudes so completely that he can't see his own father as anything but a risk factor." Frank stared at Helen's printed resume, thinking about the decades of experience summarized in neat bullet points that employers would probably dismiss without reading past the graduation dates. "What would you do if you were in my position?" Helen's smile turned predatory. "I'd remind him that age discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's illegal. And I'd do it in a way that made sure his colleagues understood the lesson too." That evening, Frank sat in his living room. Eleanor's living room, really, since he'd never changed anything after her passing, with Helen's business card in one hand and his phone in the other. He'd been working his way through a list of contacts, people who'd known him during his working years, slowly building a picture of who his son had become professionally. The conversation with Tom Bradley had been particularly enlightening. Tom had retired from the city fleet maintenance department 5 years ago, but he still had connections throughout Phoenix's municipal infrastructure. More importantly, he remembered Michael from the days when Frank used to bring his young son to the garage. "That boy always thought he was smarter than everyone else," Tom had said with the bluntness of old friendship. Nothing wrong with ambition, but Michael never seemed to understand that intelligence and wisdom aren't the same thing. He was always trying to fix problems that weren't broken. Tell me about his work, Frank had pressed. What do you hear about Pinnacle Insurance? Tom's laugh had been bitter. High-pressure place. They're always in the news for denying claims, especially for older folks. Word is, they've got quotas for turning down senior drivers. Company culture's all about youth and innovation. Anyone over 50 is considered dead weight. The phone call with Maria Santos, his former customer whose daughter worked in the insurance industry, had been even more revealing. Maria's daughter had horror stories about companies like Pinnacle, where managers were rewarded for finding creative ways to drop older clients or jack up their premiums. They have these meetings, Maria had explained, where they literally call seniors, quote, high-risk demographics, and brainstorm ways to price them out of coverage. It's disgusting, but it's legal if they're careful about how they word their policies. Frank had spent the rest of the evening researching Pinnacle Insurance online, reading customer reviews, news articles, and complaint filings. The picture that emerged was of a company that had built its profit model on systematic discrimination against older clients, all wrapped in the language of actuarial science and risk assessment. Now, sitting in Eleanor's favorite chair with her reading lamp casting a warm circle of light, Frank made his decision. He dialed Helen's number. Helen? It's Frank Martinez. I've been thinking about what you said today. About age discrimination being illegal? About reminding my son that his attitudes have consequences. I want to do something about this, but I need help understanding how his world works. Helen's voice carried satisfaction. I was hoping you'd call. I've been thinking about your situation all evening, and I have some ideas. But first, I need to ask you something important. How far are you willing to go to make your point? Frank looked around the living room where he'd raised his children, where he'd mourned his wife, where he'd been slowly accepting the idea that his useful life was over. On the mantel sat a photo of Michael's graduation from college, the young man's face bright with possibility and pride in his father's support. As far as it takes, Frank said quietly. My son thinks I'm too old to matter. I think it's time he learned the difference between being old and being obsolete. Helen's laugh was sharp and determined. Then let's go remind the insurance industry what happens when they underestimate the wisdom of experience. The next morning, Frank drove his perfectly maintained F-150 to Helen's apartment complex, marveling at how good it felt to have a sense of purpose again. Helen was waiting in the parking lot, dressed in the kind of professional attire that had probably intimidated junior executives for 3 decades. First stop, she said, climbing into the passenger seat with the confidence of someone used to taking charge, is the Department of Motor Vehicles. We're going to get you a complete copy of your driving record, along with your test scores and safety certifications. Then we're going to compile a dossier that would make any insurance investigator weep with envy. As Frank pulled out of the parking lot, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in days, his eyes held the spark of a man with a mission. Michael thought he was too old to drive safely. By the time Frank was finished, his son would understand that some roads were more dangerous when you underestimated the driver behind the wheel. The war between father and son was just beginning, and Frank Martinez had no intention of losing. The Arizona Department of Motor Vehicles on West Indian School Road buzzed with the usual mix of teenage drivers taking their first road tests, and adults grudgingly updating their registrations. Frank Martinez stood at the information counter, his request for a complete driving record analysis drawing curious glances from the clerk, a young woman named Jessica, whose name tag proclaimed her an MVD customer service specialist. Sir, most people just need the basic 5-year summary, Jessica explained, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. The comprehensive analysis you're requesting goes back to when you first got your license. That's, let me see, 1967? That's a lot of paperwork. I need everything, Frank said firmly, sliding a $20 bill across the counter. Every test score, every renewal, every clean year without violations. I want documentation that would stand up in court. Helen Garrett, standing beside him with a leather portfolio that had seen 3 decades of board meetings, smiled approvingly. What my friend is requesting is a complete driving competency profile. In the insurance industry, we call it a, quote, risk assessment historical analysis. The magic words had their intended effect. Jessica's expression shifted from mild confusion to professional interest. Helen had coached Frank on the importance of speaking the bureaucracy's language, and it was working perfectly. 30 minutes later, they walked out of the DMV with a manila folder thick enough to stop a bullet. Frank's driving record was a masterpiece of consistency. 56 years of clean renewals, test scores consistently above the 90th percentile for his age group, and a safety record that would make a commercial pilot jealous. "Look at this," Helen said, spreading the documents across the hood of Frank's truck in the parking lot. "Your last vision test scored 20/25 with corrective lenses. Your reaction time testing put you in the top 15% of drivers in your age bracket. Your written exam scores have actually improved over the years." Frank studied the numbers with the same attention he'd once given to engine specifications. "What about Michael's record?" Helen pulled out her tablet, where she'd been compiling information from public databases and professional networks. "Your son's record is interesting. 3 moving violations in the past 2 years, including that texting while driving citation. His insurance premiums are 40% higher than yours, and he's been required to take a defensive driving course twice." The irony was stunning, but Frank felt no satisfaction in it. This wasn't about proving his son was a bad driver. It was about proving that age alone didn't determine competence behind the wheel. Their next stop was the Arizona Automobile Association, where Frank had maintained his membership for 37 years. The AAA office on Camelback Road was busy with travelers planning summer road trips, but Frank wasn't there for travel advice. He was there to see Margaret Chen, the regional safety coordinator who'd administered his defensive driving courses over the years. Margaret's face lit up when she saw Frank enter her office. "Frank Martinez, I was just thinking about you last week. How are you holding up?" At 58, Margaret had the practical demeanor of someone who'd spent her career teaching people to survive on dangerous roads. She'd known Frank since his first voluntary defensive driving course 15 years ago, a course he'd taken not because of violations but because he believed in continuous improvement. "I'm doing well, Margaret, but I need a favor, a professional one." Margaret's expression grew serious as Frank explained his situation. Helen remained quiet, letting Frank tell his story in his own words. When he finished, Margaret was shaking her head in disgust. "Frank, in 23 years of teaching defensive driving, you're one of maybe a dozen students who voluntarily taken my course more than once. Most people your age, hell, most people any age, think they know everything about driving after they get their license. You're constantly learning, constantly improving." She pulled up Frank's file on her computer, scrolling through years of course completions and test scores. "Look at this progression. Your hazard recognition scores have actually gotten better over time. Your following distance calculations are textbook perfect. Your night driving assessment from last year was flawless." "But what about the stereotypes?" Helen interjected. "The assumptions about older drivers being dangerous?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "You want to know who my most dangerous students are? Men between 25 and 45 who think their reflexes make them invincible. They speed, they tailgate, they drive distracted because they're convinced they can handle anything. The seniors who voluntarily take my courses, they're some of the safest drivers on the road." She turned her monitor toward them, displaying a graph that made Frank's eyebrows rise. "These are accident statistics by age group for Arizona. Drivers over 70 have lower accident rates than any group except teenagers who've just completed driver's education. Know why? Because they're careful. They know their limitations and they compensate for them." Frank stared at the data, feeling a mixture of vindication and sadness. "So why do people think we're dangerous?" "Because insurance companies make more money when they can charge higher premiums or deny coverage entirely," Margaret said bluntly. "They've spent decades promoting the myth that age equals incompetence because it justifies their pricing models. It's not about safety, it's about profit." Helen nodded grimly. "I've seen the internal memos from companies like Pinnacle. They specifically target older drivers for premium increases, knowing that most seniors won't fight back. They're counting on people being too embarrassed or too tired to challenge the system." Margaret's eyes sharpened with interest. "Pinnacle Insurance? That's where Frank's son works?" "Middle management," Frank confirmed. He's internalized their attitudes so completely that he can't see his own father as anything but a liability. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against her desk. "Frank, would you be willing to take my advanced defensive driving assessment? Not the standard course, the one I usually reserve for commercial drivers and emergency responders? What would that prove? It would give you documentation that your driving skills exceed the standards required for professional drivers. CDL-level competency testing, hazardous condition simulation, emergency response protocols. If you pass, and I think you will, you'll have certification that would shut down any argument about your competence behind the wheel." Frank looked at Helen, who was practically vibrating with excitement. "Do it," she said. "We'll add it to our documentation." 3 hours later, Frank sat in the driver's seat of a specially equipped training vehicle, having just completed the most comprehensive driving assessment of his life. The course had included everything from emergency braking scenarios to driving while experiencing visual impairment simulation. He'd navigated through cones while responding to verbal instructions, demonstrated proper following distances at various speeds, and executed textbook-perfect parallel parking in spaces that would challenge drivers half his age. Margaret emerged from the passenger side with a huge grin. "Frank, I've been administering this test for 8 years. You just scored in the top 5% of all drivers who've taken it. That includes police officers, ambulance drivers, and long-haul truckers with millions of miles under their belts." Helen was waiting in the observation area with a digital camera, having documented every aspect of Frank's performance. "We now have objective proof that you're not just a competent driver. You're an exemplary one." As they drove away from the AAA facility, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in his own abilities. Not the defensive confidence of someone trying to prove he wasn't incompetent, but the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. "What's next?" he asked Helen. She smiled, pulling out a business card she'd been saving for the right moment. "Next, we visit someone who can tell us exactly how Pinnacle Insurance operates from the inside. I have a friend who used to work there. She left last year after filing a discrimination complaint with the state. She's been waiting for the right opportunity to expose how that company really treats older clients." The business card read, "Patricia Williams, Insurance Consumer Advocate." Below that, in smaller print, "Former Senior Claims Manager, Pinnacle Insurance Group." Frank studied the card, thinking about his son sitting in meetings where seniors were discussed as quote, high-risk demographics to be priced out of coverage. Michael had been shaped by an industry that saw people like Frank as nothing more than potential liability claims. "What did Patricia's discrimination complaint say?" Frank asked. Helen's expression darkened. "That Pinnacle has an unofficial policy of pressuring older employees to take early retirement and systematically denying claims from senior drivers. She has documentation of internal memos discussing strategies to, quote, age out their customer base." Frank felt anger building in his chest. Not the hot, impulsive anger of his confrontation with Michael, but the cold, determined fury of a man who discovered the scope of the injustice he was fighting. How many people know about this? Not enough. Patricia's complaint was settled quietly with a non-disclosure agreement. But there are ways around that if she's speaking generally about industry practices rather than specific company policies. Frank pulled into the parking lot of a Denny's restaurant, needing a moment to process everything they'd learned. In the space of one day, he'd gone from feeling like a burden to understanding that he was part of a much larger pattern of systematic discrimination. "Helen," he said slowly, "what if this isn't just about proving I can drive safely? What if this is about exposing how the insurance industry manipulates families into turning against their own elderly relatives?" Helen's smile was sharp and satisfied. "Now you're thinking like someone who's been fighting corporate discrimination for 30 years. Your son isn't the enemy, Frank. He's a victim of the same system that's trying to marginalize you. The question is, are you ready to take on that system?" Frank looked at his driving assessment results, at the documentation of his spotless record, at the evidence of an industry built on profitable myths about aging. His son thought he was too old to be trusted with precious cargo? Tomorrow, Frank would show Michael exactly how dangerous it could be to underestimate a senior citizen with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The real battle was just beginning, and Frank Martinez had never felt more ready for a fight. Patricia Williams lived in a modest townhouse in Scottsdale, the kind of place that spoke of comfortable middle-class success built over decades of hard work. When she opened her door to greet Frank and Helen, her smile was warm, but her eyes held the weary caution of someone who'd learned that speaking truth to power came with consequences. At 59, Patricia had the bearing of an executive who'd climbed her way up through corporate ranks on merit alone. Her handshake was firm, her living room was organized with military precision, and her coffee was strong enough to wake the dead. But it was the boxes stacked along one wall that caught Frank's attention. Bankers' boxes labeled with dates and case numbers, the physical evidence of a career spent navigating corporate malfeasance. "Helen tells me you're having troubles with your son at Pinnacle," Patricia said, settling into her chair with the efficiency of someone who'd conducted thousands of professional meetings. "And that he's bought into their narrative about older drivers being inherently dangerous." Frank nodded, still processing the professional atmosphere Patricia had created. This wasn't going to be a casual conversation between retirees. This was a strategic briefing. "Before we discuss specifics," Patricia continued, "I need you to understand something about Pinnacle Insurance. What happened to you with your son isn't personal. It's the result of a systematic corporate strategy that's been 15 years in the making." She stood and walked to one of the boxes, pulling out a thick folder marked Senior Driver Initiative, Internal Use Only. Frank recognized the Pinnacle logo on the cover, the same symbol he'd seen on Michael's business cards and company newsletters. "This document was part of a presentation I helped prepare in 2019, Patricia said, opening the folder to reveal charts, graphs, and PowerPoint slides. "The initiative was sold to management as a way to optimize risk assessment protocols for aging demographics. In plain English, it was a roadmap for systematically targeting older customers for premium increases and claim denials." Helen leaned forward, her expression sharp with professional interest. "How systematic are we talking about?" Patricia spread several documents across her coffee table. They identified drivers over 65 as their primary profit optimization target. The strategy involved 3 phases: data collection, narrative establishment, and market conditioning. Frank studied the documents, recognizing some of the statistical manipulations Margaret Chen had mentioned. "What kind of data collection?" "Everything," Patricia said grimly. "Medical records, prescription databases, family financial information, even social media activity of adult children." They were building psychological profiles of entire families to identify pressure points they could exploit. She pulled out another document, this one titled Family Influence Mapping. Frank's blood ran cold as he read the summary. Strategies for using adult children's financial anxieties and professional concerns to encourage voluntary policy cancellations by senior drivers. They were training their employees to manipulate families? Helen's voice carried the outrage of someone who'd seen corporate malfeasance before but never quite this cynical. "Not directly," Patricia clarified. "They were too smart for that. Instead, they created educational materials about, having difficult conversations with aging parents, and distributed them through corporate wellness programs. Your son probably attended mandatory seminars about, family financial planning and risk management in multi-generational households." Frank felt pieces clicking into place. Michael mentioned something about liability and precious cargo. Those weren't his words, were they? Patricia's smile was grim. Page 47 of the Family Influence Training Manual. "Help employees understand that emotional attachment can cloud judgment when assessing real-world liability risks involving precious cargo such as grandchildren." The calculated cruelty of it took Frank's breath away. Some corporate strategist had actually sat in a conference room and figured out how to weaponize a father's love for his grandchildren against his own self-respect. "Why?" Frank asked. "Why go to all this trouble instead of just raising premiums across the board?" "Because discrimination lawsuits are expensive," Patricia explained. "But if they could convince families to make these decisions voluntarily, if they could make it seem like loving concern rather than corporate policy, they could achieve the same financial goals without legal exposure." Helen was taking notes in a small pad, her executive secretary instincts still sharp after all these years. "How successful was this strategy?" Patricia pulled out a different folder, this one marked with red tabs indicating confidential material. Extremely. Between 2019 and 2023, Pinnacle reduced their senior driver customer base by 34%, while simultaneously increasing per-policy profitability by 28%. They eliminated what they considered their least profitable demographic, while making it look like a series of individual family decisions. Frank stared at the numbers, thinking about how many families had been torn apart by manufactured conflicts over driving privileges. How many competent seniors had been convinced they were dangerous? How many adult children had been coached into betraying their parents' dignity for the illusion of safety? What about the employees? Frank asked. Did they know what they were doing? Patricia's expression softened slightly. Most of them didn't. The training was presented as legitimate risk management education. Managers like your son were told they were learning how to help families make difficult but necessary decisions. They genuinely believed they were protecting people. She pulled out a photograph from one of her folders. A company retreat where smiling employees posed with motivational banners about excellence in customer care and protecting families through smart risk assessment. I was at this retreat, Patricia said, pointing to her younger self in the background of the photo. I listened to presentations about how we were pioneers in, quote, compassionate aging services. It wasn't until I started processing the actual claims denials that I realized what we were really doing. Frank studied the photo, looking for his son among the faces. What changed your mind? Patricia's face hardened. A case that came across my desk in late 2022. 81-year-old woman, spotless driving record, needed coverage for a medical transport van she was buying to drive her disabled grandson to therapy appointments. Her adult daughter, a Pinnacle employee, had convinced her to cancel her previous policy because it was too expensive for someone her age. She pulled out a thick case file, its contents meticulously organized. The woman applied for new coverage through us. Clean record, professional driver assessment, even letters of recommendation from medical professionals about her competence. We denied her application based on quote, 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 quote. Frank felt sick. What happened to her? She couldn't get coverage anywhere else at a price she could afford. Had to sell the van. Her grandson missed 3 months of critical therapy because she couldn't legally transport him. Patricia's voice was tight with controlled anger. That's when I started digging into the denial patterns and realized we were systematically targeting the most vulnerable people in our customer base. Helen looked up from her notes. Is that when you filed your discrimination complaint? That's when I started documenting everything, Patricia corrected. The complaint came later, after I realized the scope of what was happening. By then, I had evidence of hundreds of similar cases. Competent senior drivers being denied coverage or priced out of the market through deliberate policy manipulation. She gestured toward the boxes lining her wall. 3 years' worth of documentation. Case files, internal memos, training materials, statistical analyses that were buried because they contradicted the narrative about dangerous older drivers. Frank felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Patricia was revealing. How many people are we talking about? How many families affected? Patricia pulled out a spreadsheet that made Frank's eyes widen. In Arizona alone? Conservative estimate is 12,000 families between 2019 and 2023. Nationwide, we're probably looking at close to 500,000 seniors who were either denied coverage or manipulated into dropping their policies. The numbers were staggering, but what hit Frank hardest was the personal dimension. 500,000 families torn apart by manufactured conflicts. 500,000 competent older adults convinced they were dangerous. 500,000 adult children coached into betraying their parents' dignity. What can we do about it? Frank asked. Patricia smiled, and for the first time since they'd arrived, it was a genuinely happy expression. That depends on how far you're willing to go. Your son works for Pinnacle, which means he has access to current training materials and policy documents. If we can demonstrate that his attitudes toward your driving competence were shaped by corporate discrimination training, we have grounds for both a civil rights complaint and a whistleblower lawsuit. Helen's pen stopped moving. You're talking about exposing his employer. That could destroy his career. His employer is destroying families, Patricia replied firmly. The question is whether his career is more important than stopping a systematic campaign of age discrimination that's affecting hundreds of thousands of people. Frank thought about Michael's children, about the camping trip that had started this entire conflict, about the countless other grandparents who'd been separated from their families by corporate manipulation disguised as concern. "What would you need from me?" Frank asked. Patricia's smile turned predatory. "I need you to visit your son at work. I need you to have a conversation with his supervisors about their family influence training programs. And I need you to record every word of that conversation." She pulled out a small digital recording device, no bigger than a thumb drive. "This is voice-activated and has 48 hours of battery life. Perfectly legal in Arizona as long as one party to the conversation consents to recording." Frank looked at the device, understanding that accepting it would cross a line he couldn't uncross. His fight with Michael would become something much larger, a direct assault on the corporate machinery that had turned his son against him. "Once we have evidence of their discriminatory training materials being applied to real-world situations," Patricia continued, "we can take it to the Arizona Attorney General's office, the Department of Insurance, and probably the FBI's white-collar crime division." Helen was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "Frank, this could get very complicated very quickly. Are you sure you want to take on a fight this big?" Frank picked up the recording device, feeling its weight in his palm. Such a small thing to carry such enormous potential for consequences. He thought about his son sitting in training sessions, being taught to see his own father as a liability. He thought about all the other families being manipulated by the same system. "My son thinks I'm too old to be trusted with precious cargo," Frank said quietly. "Maybe it's time I showed him what happens when you underestimate someone who's been fighting longer than you've been alive." Patricia's laugh was sharp and satisfied. "Then let's go remind Pinnacle Insurance that some roads are more dangerous when you think you control all the traffic." Frank pocketed the recording device and stood up, feeling more purposeful than he had in years. His personal fight with Michael was about to become a war against the system that had created their conflict in the first place. The question wasn't whether he was too old to drive safely. The question was whether he was too old to fight back against institutional discrimination. And Frank Martinez was about to provide a definitive answer. The Pinnacle Insurance Group headquarters rose from the Scottsdale business district like a monument to corporate efficiency, its glass and steel facade reflecting the Arizona sun with cold precision. Frank Martinez sat in his F-150 in the visitor parking lot, the recording device in his shirt pocket feeling heavier than any tool he'd ever carried. Helen sat beside him, her laptop open to a detailed floor plan of the building they'd obtained through her network of former corporate contacts. "Remember," Helen said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd prepared for countless high-stakes meetings, "you're not there to confront Michael directly. You're there to speak with his supervisors about family support services." Patricia's research shows they have a dedicated employee wellness department that handles these kinds of conversations. Frank nodded, studying the employee directory Helen had compiled. "And if Michael sees me, then you're a concerned parent who wanted to understand the company resources available to help families navigate difficult conversations about aging." Helen's smile was razor-sharp. "Everything we're doing is perfectly legitimate from their perspective." Frank checked his watch, 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. According to Patricia's intelligence, this was when the Employee Wellness Department conducted their weekly family dynamics seminars, the sessions where employees like Michael learned to identify and address safety concerns involving elderly family members. The lobby of Pinnacle Insurance was exactly what Frank had expected: expensive marble, motivational posters about protecting your future, and a reception desk manned by young, professionally groomed staff who looked like they'd been hired more for appearance than experience. Frank approached the desk with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. "Good afternoon," he said to the receptionist, a young man whose name tag identified him as Brandon, Customer Success Specialist. "I'm Frank Martinez. I'd like to speak with someone in your Employee Wellness Department about family support services." Brandon's smile was reflexively bright, but his eyes showed confusion. "Are you one of our employees, Mr. Martinez?" "My son is. Michael Martinez, in the Risk Assessment Division. I understand you have programs to help employees deal with family situations that might affect workplace performance." Frank kept his voice casual, like a concerned parent seeking resources, rather than a man preparing to expose systematic discrimination. Brandon's expression shifted to sympathetic understanding. "Oh, you're looking for our Family Dynamics Support Program. That's wonderful. We're very proud of those services. Let me call upstairs and see if someone can meet with you." 5 minutes later, Frank found himself being escorted to the 15th floor by a woman named Jennifer Walsh, whose title of Senior Family Wellness Coordinator was emblazoned on a business card she'd handed him in the elevator. She was perhaps 45, with the kind of polished competence that spoke of advanced degrees in psychology or social work. "Mr. Martinez, I'm so pleased you reached out," Jennifer said as they walked down a corridor lined with motivational posters. "It shows real family commitment when parents take an active interest in supporting their adult children's professional development." Frank noted the subtle framing. His visit wasn't about his own concerns, but about supporting Michael's career. "I want to understand what resources are available. Michael mentioned some workplace training about family situations, and I thought it might be helpful for me to learn more." Jennifer's smile widened with genuine enthusiasm. "That's exactly the kind of proactive thinking we encourage. Too many family conflicts could be avoided if everyone understood the modern approaches to intergenerational communication." She led him into a conference room where the walls were covered with charts and graphs about effective family risk assessment and navigating difficult conversations with aging relatives. Frank felt his jaw clench as he recognized some of the language Patricia had shown him, but he kept his expression neutral and interested. "Please, have a seat," Jennifer said, settling across from him with a tablet and several professionally bound booklets. "Tell me a bit about your family situation. What specific challenges are you and Michael working through?" Frank had rehearsed this moment with Helen and Patricia, but actually sitting here, surrounded by the corporate machinery that had manipulated his relationship with his son, required every ounce of his self-control. "Well," Frank began carefully, "Michael seems concerned about my driving. He thinks I might be unsafe behind the wheel because of my age. I'm wondering if that's something your workplace training addresses." Jennifer's face lit up with professional satisfaction. "Oh, absolutely. That's one of our most successful intervention areas. We've helped hundreds of employees navigate exactly that conversation with their aging parents." She opened one of the booklets and turned it toward Frank. The title page read, "Compassionate Safety Conversations: Helping Aging Family Members Recognize Driving Limitations." "The key," Jennifer continued, her voice taking on the tone of an expert delivering well-rehearsed talking points, "is helping older family members understand that driving competence isn't about experience or past performance. It's about current physiological capabilities. Age-related changes in vision, reaction time, and cognitive processing make driving inherently more dangerous for seniors, regardless of their driving history." Frank felt his hands clench involuntarily, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "Even for seniors with clean driving records? Especially for seniors with clean driving records?" Jennifer's enthusiasm was genuine and deeply disturbing. "Those are often the most dangerous drivers because they're overconfident in abilities that have actually declined significantly. A clean record can actually indicate that an older driver has been lucky rather than skilled." She flipped to a page filled with statistics and charts. "Look at these numbers. Seniors are involved in proportionally more fatal accidents than any demographic except teenage males. The data is very clear about the increased risk." Frank recognized the statistics from Patricia's documentation, the manipulated data that excluded context about miles driven, driving conditions, and the differences between causation and correlation. But here, in this sterile conference room, the numbers were presented as objective, scientific fact. "What kind of guidance do you give employees about having these conversations?" Frank asked. Jennifer pulled out her tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed training module. "We teach them to focus on love and protection rather than capability assessment. The message is, I care too much about you and your grandchildren to risk tragedy, because we were afraid to have a difficult conversation." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. They were almost identical to what Michael had said in the garage. His son hadn't been speaking from his own heart. He'd been reciting corporate training materials. "We also teach employees to emphasize the financial liability aspects," Jennifer continued, oblivious to Frank's internal struggle. "If an aging parent causes an accident, especially one involving their grandchildren, the financial and emotional consequences can be devastating for the entire family." Frank's recording device was capturing every word. But he felt sick listening to the calculated manipulation being described as family support. What if the aging parent resists? What if they have documentation of their driving competence? Jennifer's smile didn't waver. That's actually very common. Denial is a natural response to aging. We teach employees to be patient but firm, to focus on worst-case scenarios rather than getting bogged down in arguments about current competence. She pulled up another screen on her tablet. We have scripted responses for common objections. For example, if a parent says they have a clean driving record, the employee learns to respond with something like, "I know you've been a great driver, Dad, but accidents happen in split seconds. And I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you or the kids because I was too afraid to speak up." The casual way she discussed manipulating elderly parents made Frank's stomach turn. These weren't family support services. They were psychological warfare tactics disguised as corporate wellness programs. How many employees have used these services? Frank asked, fighting to keep his voice neutral. Jennifer checked her tablet. In the past 2 years, we've provided family dynamics counseling to over 800 employees dealing with aging parent situations. Our success rate for voluntary driving cessation among elderly family members is 78%. Success rate for voluntary driving cessation. They were actually tracking how effectively they could manipulate families into surrendering their elderly relatives' independence. That's impressive, Frank managed. We're very proud of the program, Jennifer said, her professional satisfaction obvious. It's become a model for other companies in our industry. We've even published papers in insurance trade journals about the correlation between employee family wellness and reduced liability exposure. Frank felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. This wasn't just about individual families. Pinnacle was literally teaching other companies how to replicate their discrimination strategies. I'd like to learn more about these published papers, Frank said carefully. Jennifer's enthusiasm peaked. Of course. I can provide you with copies of our research. We have extensive documentation of outcomes, cost-benefit analyses, even psychological profiles of successful intervention strategies. She was offering him evidence of systematic discrimination, proudly presenting it as corporate innovation. Frank realized that in their arrogance, Pinnacle had documented their own illegal activities and were now bragging about them to the father of one of their victims. Jennifer, Frank said quietly, I have one more question. Do you really believe that a 72-year-old man with 56 years of clean driving record, current safety certifications, and test scores above the 90th percentile for his age group is inherently dangerous behind the wheel? Jennifer's smile faltered slightly, but her corporate training kicked in. Mr. Martinez, individual cases aren't really relevant to the broader statistical patterns. Risk assessment has to be based on demographic data rather than personal anecdotes. Frank stood up slowly, feeling the weight of everything he'd learned settling into his bones. Thank you, Jennifer. This has been very educational. As he walked back toward the elevator, Frank's mind was reeling with the scope of what he'd uncovered. His son hadn't betrayed him out of malice or even genuine concern. Michael had been systematically trained to see his father as a liability, coached to manipulate him through manufactured guilt and fear. The elevator doors closed, and Frank found himself alone with the recorded evidence of institutional discrimination so brazen that they proudly showcased it as employee benefits. Patricia had been right. This wasn't about individual prejudice. This was about corporate strategy designed to eliminate entire demographics while making it seem like loving family concern. When he reached the lobby, Frank pulled out his phone and sent a simple text message to Helen. Got everything we need. Time to take down the house. The war between father and son was over. The war against systematic discrimination was just beginning. Palpatine hell. Patricia Williams' dining room had been transformed into a war room. Laptops hummed on every surface. Legal documents covered the table in neat stacks, and the recording device that had captured Jennifer Walsh's damning admissions sat in the center like a smoking gun. Frank Martinez stared at the transcripts Helen had typed up, still struggling to process the calculated cruelty of what Pinnacle Insurance had done to his family. "This is bigger than we thought," Patricia said, her voice carrying the grim satisfaction of someone whose worst suspicions had been confirmed. "Jennifer didn't just give you evidence of discrimination, she handed you documentation of a criminal enterprise." Helen looked up from her laptop, where she'd been cross-referencing the recorded statements with federal discrimination laws. The systematic targeting of protected demographics, the psychological manipulation tactics, the intercompany coordination. We're looking at potential RICO violations here. Frank felt overwhelmed by the legal complexity that had grown around his simple desire to prove he was still competent to drive. "What does that mean for Michael?" "For my grandchildren?" Patricia's expression softened slightly. "It means your son was a victim, not a perpetrator. Everything he said to you came directly from corporate training materials, designed to exploit his natural protective instincts and turn them against his own family." She pulled out one of Jennifer's training booklets, opening to a page that made Frank's chest tighten with recognition. "Look at this script. Dad, I care too much about you and the grandchildren to risk tragedy because we were afraid to have a difficult conversation. Word for word what Michael said to you." The revelation should have brought relief, but Frank felt only a deeper anger. His son hadn't chosen to betray him. Michael had been systematically programmed to see his father as a threat to his children's safety. "How many other families are going through this right now?" Frank asked. Helen consulted her notes. "Based on Jennifer's statistics and Patricia's documentation, we're looking at approximately 50 new cases per week just in Arizona. Nationwide, probably 2,000 families per month are being torn apart by these manipulation programs." The numbers were staggering, but they also represented something else: an opportunity to strike back on behalf of every family that had been destroyed by corporate greed disguised as concern. Frank's phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Dad, we need to talk. Jennifer Walsh from my company called and said you visited today. What's going on?" Frank stared at the message, understanding that his infiltration of Pinnacle had triggered corporate damage control protocols. Jennifer had probably realized, too late, that she'd revealed far more than she should have to a complete stranger. "They know," Frank said, showing the text to Patricia and Helen. Patricia smiled grimly. "Good. That means they're scared. Scared people make mistakes." Helen was already typing rapidly on her laptop. "I'm uploading everything to secure cloud storage and sending copies to my contact at the Arizona Attorney General's office. If Pinnacle tries to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses, we'll have documentation of that too." Frank looked at his phone again, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. "I'm going to see Michael. Tonight. At his house." "Frank," Patricia said carefully, "once you tell him what we've discovered, there's no going back. His entire career is going to be affected by this. His entire career is built on systematically destroying families like ours," Frank replied. "Maybe it's time he understood the cost of what he's been doing." That evening, Frank drove his F-150 through the familiar streets of Michael's suburban neighborhood, passing houses where other families were probably having their own versions of the conversation that had destroyed his relationship with his son. How many aging parents were being convinced they were dangerous? How many adult children were being taught to see their elderly relatives as liabilities? Michael's house was ablaze with lights when Frank arrived, suggesting that the family meeting he was about to interrupt had been going on for some time. Through the living room window, Frank could see Michael pacing while his wife Sarah sat on the couch with their two teenagers, Emma and Jake. The scene looked disturbingly like an intervention. Frank took a deep breath, checked that the recording device was still in his pocket, and rang the doorbell. Michael opened the door immediately, his face a mixture of confusion, anger, and what looked like genuine fear. "Dad, what the hell did you do at my office today?" "I went to learn about the family support services your company provides," Frank said calmly. "Very educational. Can we talk?" Michael stepped aside reluctantly, and Frank entered a living room where the tension was thick enough to cut. Sarah's face was pale with worry, while Emma and Jake looked between their father and grandfather with the confused anxiety of children caught in adult drama they didn't understand. "Kids, go upstairs," Michael said tersely. "No," Frank said firmly. "They should hear this." They're old enough to understand how their family was manipulated, and they deserve to know the truth. Michael's jaw tightened. Dad, I don't know what Jennifer told you, but… She told me everything, Frank interrupted, pulling out his phone and accessing the recording app. She told me about the scripts you were taught to use on me. She told me about the success rates for forcing elderly parents to stop driving. She told me about the research papers your company publishes on psychological manipulation tactics. The color drained from Michael's face. You recorded her? I recorded a corporate representative bragging about systematic age discrimination, Frank corrected. I recorded evidence of your company training employees to manipulate their own families. I recorded proof that everything you said to me in my garage came from a corporate manual designed to destroy relationships between aging parents and their adult children. Sarah leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael, is that true? Michael looked trapped, his corporate training warring with his basic decency. It's not manipulation. It's risk assessment. It's helping families make difficult but necessary decisions. Frank pressed play on the recording. Jennifer Walsh's voice filled the living room with clinical precision. We teach employees to focus on worst-case scenarios, rather than getting bogged down in arguments about current competence. Our success rate for voluntary driving cessation among elderly family members is 78%. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma, now 16 and sharp enough to understand implications, spoke first. Dad, you went to corporate training sessions about how to convince Grandpa to stop driving? Michael's voice was defensive but lacked conviction. The training was about family safety, about helping aging relatives understand their limitations. Frank pulled out the folder of documents Patricia had given him. Michael, your company targets seniors with clean driving records specifically because they're quote 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 quote. They teach employees that a lifetime of safe driving is actually evidence of danger, not competence. He spread Jennifer's training materials across the coffee table. This manual teaches you to ignore objective evidence of driving competence and focus on emotional manipulation. It literally provides scripts for making elderly parents feel guilty about endangering their grandchildren. Sarah picked up one of the booklets, her face growing paler as she read. Michael, this is horrible. They're teaching you to gaslight your own father. It's not gaslighting, Michael protested, but his voice lacked conviction. It's based on statistical analysis of age-related driving risks. Frank pulled out his driving assessment results from Margaret Chen. Here's my actual competency evaluation, Michael. Top 5% of all drivers tested, including commercial drivers and emergency responders. Here's my driving record, 56 years without an at-fault accident. Here are my vision test results, my reaction time scores, my defensive driving certifications. He spread the documents methodically, creating an evidence display that would have impressed any courtroom. Now show me the statistical analysis that says I'm more dangerous than you, with your 3 tickets and parking lot accident. Michael stared at the documents, and Frank could see the moment when corporate programming collided with objective reality. His son's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and growing horror as he began to understand how thoroughly he'd been manipulated. Oh, God, Michael whispered, sinking into a chair. Dad, They made it seem so logical. The training sessions, the case studies, the statistics. They showed us videos of elderly drivers causing accidents, stories about families destroyed by preventable tragedies. Propaganda, Frank said quietly. Designed to make you see your own father as a threat to your children. Designed to turn your protective instincts against the man who raised you. Jake, Frank's 13-year-old grandson, had been listening with the intense focus that teenagers brought to adult drama. Dad, does this mean Grandpa was right? That you were being mean to him for no reason? The question hung in the air, like an accusation. Michael looked at his youngest child, then at his father, Then at the evidence spread across his coffee table that proved he'd been systematically trained to betray his own family. "I'm sorry," Michael said, his voice breaking. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I thought I was protecting everyone. I thought I was being responsible." Frank felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. His son had been a victim too, programmed by corporate psychologists to see love as liability and experience as evidence of decline. "Michael," Frank said gently, "the question now isn't whether you were wrong. The question is what you're going to do about it. Your company is destroying thousands of families using the same tactics they used on us. Are you going to help them continue? Or are you going to help me stop them?" Michael looked around his living room, at his wife's horrified expression, at his children's confused faces, at his father's evidence of systematic corporate manipulation. Frank could see the moment when his son made his choice. "What do you need me to do?" Michael asked quietly. Frank smiled for the first time in weeks. "I need you to be my son again, and then I need you to help me take down the people who tried to turn us against each other." The war between father and son was finally over. The war against Pinnacle Insurance was about to begin in earnest. The Phoenix offices of the Arizona Attorney General buzzed with the controlled intensity of a place where justice was more than just a concept on courthouse walls. Frank Martinez sat in a conference room on the 14th floor, surrounded by federal prosecutors, state investigators, and civil rights attorneys who'd spent the last 3 days reviewing the evidence he'd helped compile against Pinnacle Insurance. Michael sat beside his father, still wearing his Pinnacle employee badge, but now serving as a key witness, rather than a corporate loyalist. The transformation had been remarkable. Once his son understood the scope of the manipulation, he'd become Frank's most valuable ally in exposing the company's systematic discrimination. "Mr. Martinez," said Assistant Attorney General Rebecca Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in corporate civil rights violations, "what you've uncovered goes far beyond simple age discrimination. We're looking at a coordinated criminal enterprise that spans multiple states and potentially affects millions of families." Frank nodded, still processing the magnitude of what their investigation had revealed. "I just wanted to prove I was still competent to drive. I had no idea it would lead to this." Patricia Williams, now serving as an official consultant to the investigation, spread additional documents across the conference table. "Since Frank's recording went public, we've been contacted by over 2,000 families with similar stories. Competent seniors forced out of driving by adult children who'd been coached by their employers to see aging parents as liabilities." Michael cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of someone confessing to crimes he hadn't known he was committing. "The training was so sophisticated that none of us realized what we were really doing. They presented everything as evidence-based family counseling, backed by insurance industry research and psychological studies." Special Agent David Kim from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division leaned forward. "Michael, can you walk us through the employee incentive structures again? The part about promotion criteria tied to family intervention success rates?" Michael's face tightened with remembered shame. Employees who successfully helped elderly family members transition away from driving received higher performance ratings. It was presented as community service. We were supposedly preventing accidents and saving lives. Managers who had multiple family intervention successes were fast-tracked for promotions. Frank felt sick every time he heard these details. His son's career advancement had been partially based on his willingness to destroy his relationship with his own father. Rebecca Chen was taking notes on a legal pad. "We've subpoenaed Pinnacle's training records, employee evaluations, and internal communications going back 5 years. What we're finding is evidence of deliberate psychological conditioning designed to override employees' natural family loyalty." She pulled out a thick folder marked "Pinnacle Internal Communications, Confidential." Email threads between corporate psychologists and training coordinators discussing how to quote filial anxiety and protective instincts to achieve policy cancellation targets. Helen Garrett, who'd been working as an unpaid consultant since the investigation began, looked up from her laptop where she'd been coordinating with victims' families across the country. "We now have documented cases in 47 states. Pinnacle franchises this training program to other insurance companies under the name Family Dynamics Risk Management. The scope was staggering. What had started as Frank's personal fight with his son had uncovered a nationwide conspiracy to systematically separate elderly Americans from their independence and dignity. "What's our next move?" Frank asked. Agent Kim smiled grimly. "Tomorrow morning, we execute coordinated search warrants on Pinnacle facilities in 12 states. We'll be seizing servers, training materials, employee records, and financial documents. Your recording gave us probable cause for the biggest insurance fraud investigation in Arizona history." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "What happens to current employees?" "People like me who didn't know what they were really doing?" Rebecca Chen's expression softened slightly. "Employees who cooperate with the investigation and can demonstrate they were victims of the manipulation themselves will likely face no criminal charges. The executives who designed and implemented these programs are a different matter entirely." Frank thought about Jennifer Walsh, the enthusiastic family wellness coordinator, who'd unknowingly confessed to systematic discrimination on tape. "Will they try to claim they didn't know it was illegal?" Patricia laughed bitterly. "Oh, they knew. We found internal legal memos from 2018 warning that their training programs could constitute civil rights violations. The legal department recommended discontinuing the family intervention strategies. Corporate leadership chose to ignore those warnings and expand the programs instead." She pulled out a damning email chain that made Frank's blood boil. "Here's the smoking gun. A memo from Pinnacle's CEO to regional managers. The legal risks of family intervention training are acceptable given the profit margins achieved through senior policy reduction. Continue implementation but improve documentation security." Michael stared at the email in horror. They knew they were breaking the law and decided it was worth it? "The profit margins were too good to pass up," Agent Kim explained. By manipulating employees into pressuring their elderly relatives to cancel policies, Pinnacle reduced their highest-cost demographic by 34% while avoiding direct discrimination lawsuits. From a purely financial standpoint, it was brilliantly evil. Frank felt anger burning in his chest, but it was a cold, focused fury now rather than the hot rage he'd felt in his garage weeks ago. How many families will never recover from this? How many relationships were permanently destroyed? Helen looked up from her laptop, her expression grave. "Based on our preliminary surveys, approximately 60% of families affected by these manipulation programs never fully reconcile. Even when the elderly parents are vindicated, the betrayal cuts too deep to heal completely." The statistic hit Frank like a physical blow. He and Michael had been lucky. They'd discovered the truth behind their conflict before it was too late. Hundreds of thousands of other families would never get that chance. "What can we do for those families?" Frank asked. Rebecca Chen consulted her notes. "The civil damages portion of this case could result in the largest age discrimination settlement in U.S. history. We're talking about potential compensation for every family that can demonstrate they were affected by Pinnacle's training programs." "And criminal charges?" Michael asked quietly. Agent Kim's smile was predatory. "Conspiracy to violate civil rights, wire fraud, racketeering, and about 15 other federal felonies. The executives who designed this system are looking at serious prison time." Frank thought about all the elderly drivers who'd been convinced they were dangerous, all the adult children who'd been programmed to betray their parents' dignity, all the families torn apart by corporate greed disguised as concern for safety. "When do we go public with this?" Frank asked. Patricia was already pulling out her phone. "I have contacts at 3 major news networks who've been waiting for our signal. Once the search warrants are executed tomorrow, this story goes national. Pinnacle Insurance won't be able to hide behind corporate PR spin anymore." Michael looked around the conference room at the evidence of his employer's systematic criminality. "Dad, I need to ask you something. Can you ever forgive me for what I put you through?" Frank studied his son's face, seeing not the corporate drone who'd tried to take away his keys, but the boy he'd raised to believe in doing the right thing. "Michael, you were a victim too. The question isn't whether I can forgive you, it's whether you can forgive yourself for being manipulated into hurting people you love." Michael's eyes filled with tears. I recommended colleagues for promotion based on how successfully they'd pressured their elderly parents to stop driving. I celebrated when coworkers told me they'd convinced their fathers to give up their independence. I thought I was helping people. You were helping people, Frank said gently. You were helping corporate executives get richer by exploiting families. The question is, what are you going to do now that you know the truth? Michael straightened, and Frank saw something he hadn't seen in his son's face for years: moral conviction unclouded by corporate programming. I want to testify. At the trials, at the congressional hearings, wherever my voice can help make sure this never happens to another family. Rebecca Chen smiled with satisfaction. Michael, your testimony is going to be crucial. A Pinnacle employee describing the manipulation tactics from the inside will be devastating to their defense. Agent Kim gathered his files, preparing to leave for what promised to be a very busy day of warrant executions. Mr. Martinez, I want you to know that your decision to fight back instead of accepting your son's assessment has probably saved thousands of families from going through what you experienced. Frank looked around the conference room at the alliance of prosecutors, investigators, and victims that had grown from his simple desire to prove he was still competent to drive. Tomorrow, the largest insurance fraud investigation in state history would begin, and Pinnacle Insurance would learn what happened when they underestimated a 72-year-old mechanic who refused to be discarded. My son said I was too old to drive, Frank said quietly. Turns out I was just getting started. The real justice was still ahead, but for the first time in weeks, Frank Martinez felt like the road was clear. 6 months after Frank Martinez first drove his F-150 to the Pinnacle Insurance headquarters, he found himself behind the wheel of the same truck, pulling into the parking lot of the federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix. But this time, he wasn't alone. Michael sat in the passenger seat, wearing a navy blue suit and carrying a briefcase full of internal Pinnacle documents that would help seal the prosecution's case against his former employer. The media circus outside the courthouse was unlike anything Frank had ever seen. News vans from major networks lined the street, reporters positioned themselves at every entrance, and protesters carrying signs reading, "Corporate discrimination kills families" and "Age is not a crime," filled the courthouse steps. Frank's story had become a national symbol of the fight against systematic ageism, and today was the culmination of everything they'd worked toward. You ready for this, Dad? Michael asked as they approached the courthouse entrance. Frank adjusted his tie, the same one he'd worn to Eleanor's funeral, now pressed and cleaned for his moment in the spotlight. I've been ready for this my whole life, son. I just didn't know it until 6 months ago. Inside the courthouse, the scene was controlled chaos. The largest courtroom in the building had been reserved for what legal experts were calling the most significant age discrimination case in U.S. history. Frank took his seat in the front row, surrounded by other elderly victims of Pinnacle's manipulation programs and their families. Patricia Williams sat to his left, Helen Garrett to his right, both women having become surrogate family members during the long months of investigation and preparation. The prosecution team, led by Assistant Attorney General Rebecca Chen, had spent months building an airtight case against Pinnacle's corporate leadership. The evidence was overwhelming. Internal emails documenting deliberate discrimination, training materials designed to manipulate families, financial records showing massive profits from forcing seniors out of the insurance market, and testimony from dozens of employees who'd been programmed to betray their own relatives. Judge Margaret Thornton, a distinguished woman in her 60s who'd built her career fighting corporate malfeasance, called the court to order. The defendants, CEO Richard Morrison, VP of Training Jennifer Walsh, and Regional Director Thomas Bradley, sat at the defense table looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Before we proceed with sentencing, Judge Thornton announced, I want to hear victim impact statements from some of the families affected by the defendant's criminal conspiracy. Frank had volunteered to speak first, representing not just his own family but the thousands of others who'd been torn apart by Pinnacle's systematic manipulation. He walked to the podium with steady steps, his hand showing none of the tremor that had plagued him during his months of doubt and self-questioning. Your Honor, Frank began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived through 7 decades of American history. 6 months ago, my son told me I was too old to drive safely. He said I was a danger to my own grandchildren, that my reflexes were shot, that my very presence behind the wheel put everyone at risk. He paused, looking directly at the defendants. What I didn't know then was that my son's words weren't his own. They came from corporate training materials designed by these defendants to manipulate employees into betraying their elderly family members. My son didn't choose to hurt me. He was programmed to see me as a liability by people who saw profit in destroying families. Frank pulled out his driving assessment results, the same documents that had vindicated him months earlier. I am 72 years old. I have driven for 56 years without a single at-fault accident. My last competency assessment placed me in the top 5% of all drivers tested, including commercial drivers and emergency responders. But according to Pinnacle Insurance's training materials, none of that mattered because my age alone made me inherently dangerous. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens and the soft whir of recording equipment. Frank continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. The defendants didn't just steal my son's respect for my competence. They stole precious time from our relationship. 6 months of believing that the man who raised me, who taught me to drive, who trusted me with his business and his customers' safety, had lost faith in my abilities. 6 months of questioning whether I really was the burden my son seemed to think I was. He turned to address the packed courtroom. But I was one of the lucky ones. My family discovered the truth before it was too late. We found out that we'd been manipulated, that our conflict was manufactured by corporate greed. How many families will never get that chance? How many elderly parents died believing their children saw them as nothing more than expensive, dangerous liabilities? Frank's voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. The defendants created a system that turned love into exploitation, that weaponized children's protective instincts against their own parents. They didn't just discriminate against seniors, they turned families into instruments of that discrimination. Judge Thornton nodded grimly. Mr. Martinez, how has this experience affected your relationship with your son? Frank looked back at Michael, who was wiping tears from his eyes. Your Honor, my son and I have rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of truth rather than corporate manipulation. He's resigned from Pinnacle and now works with senior advocacy groups to educate families about age discrimination. We've turned our pain into purpose. Over the next 2 hours, other families shared similar stories. Margaret Chen from AAA testified about the systematic way Pinnacle had corrupted legitimate safety education. Patricia Williams presented evidence of the company's nationwide expansion of discriminatory practices. Michael took the stand as a key witness, describing in devastating detail how employees were trained to override their natural family loyalty in service of corporate profit. When the victim statements concluded, Judge Thornton delivered her sentence with the fury of someone who'd seen the full scope of institutional cruelty. The defendants have been found guilty of conspiracy to violate civil rights, wire fraud, racketeering, and multiple other federal crimes. But more than that, they have been found guilty of weaponizing the most basic human relationships against vulnerable populations. She looked directly at CEO Morrison, whose arrogant confidence had evaporated during weeks of testimony. Mr. Morrison, your company didn't just commit insurance fraud, you created a system that turned children into unwitting agents of discrimination against their own parents. You exploited love to generate profit, and you did it with full knowledge that your actions were destroying families. The sentences were severe. Morrison received 12 years in federal prison, Walsh got 8 years, and Bradley received 6 years. The financial penalties were even more crushing. Pinnacle Insurance was ordered to pay $2.3 billion in damages to affected families, effectively bankrupting the company and sending a message to the entire insurance industry. But for Frank, the real victory wasn't the criminal convictions or the financial settlements. The real victory was waiting for him outside the courthouse, where 3 generations of his family stood together in the Arizona sunshine. Emma, now 17 and preparing for college, ran to hug her grandfather with the enthusiasm of someone who'd learned not to take family relationships for granted. Grandpa, you did it! You actually took down a whole corporation. Jake, now 14 and taller than his grandfather remembered, grinned with pride. Dad says you're going to write a book about all this. Can I help? Sarah, Michael's wife, embraced Frank with genuine warmth. Thank you for fighting for our family, even when we didn't deserve it. Michael stood slightly apart, still processing his role in the whole ordeal. Frank approached his son, understanding that their relationship would always carry the scars of what they'd been through, but also knowing that those scars had made them stronger. Son, Frank said quietly, you asked me once if I could forgive you. But the truth is, there's nothing to forgive. We were both victims of something bigger than either of us understood. The question now is what we do with what we've learned. Michael's voice was thick with emotion. I want to spend the rest of my career making sure this never happens to another family. I want to honor the time we lost by protecting the time other families still have. Frank nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with legal victories or financial settlements. Then let's get started. As they walked toward the parking garage, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with his son questioning his competence behind the wheel, and had ended with a federal investigation that exposed systematic discrimination affecting millions of Americans. Helen Garrett, walking beside him, smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd fought corporate malfeasance for decades. So, Frank, what's next? You've toppled a criminal enterprise, reunited your family, and become a national symbol of resistance to age discrimination. What does a 72-year-old retired mechanic do for an encore? Frank laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. Well, Helen, I think I might take a road trip. Maybe drive my truck to Washington, D.C., and testify before Congress about insurance industry reform. The drive would do me good, assuming I can still handle the responsibility of operating such a dangerous vehicle. Patricia Williams, overhearing the conversation, grinned. Frank, with your driving record and the advanced defensive driving certification you earned during all this, you're probably qualified to teach driving safety to commercial truckers. As they reached Frank's F-150, still gleaming and perfectly maintained after all these months, Michael paused. Dad, would you mind if I rode with you today? I know I can drive myself, but... But what, son? Michael's smile was genuine and free of the corporate programming that had once clouded his judgment. But I trust you behind the wheel more than I trust myself. You've proven that experience and wisdom matter more than age and assumptions. Frank handed his son the passenger side keys, not because he was surrendering control, but because he was sharing it with someone who'd finally learned to value it properly. As they drove through Phoenix toward their family celebration dinner, Frank caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at him wasn't the diminished senior citizen his son had tried to see 6 months ago. He was a victorious warrior who'd fought institutional discrimination and won, a grandfather who'd protected not just his own family but thousands of others, and a 72-year-old driver who'd proven that some roads were most dangerous when traveled by those who underestimated the wisdom behind the wheel. The war against age discrimination was far from over, but Frank Martinez had fired the first shot and shown that seniors weren't too old to fight back. In fact, they were just getting started. The odometer on his F-150 showed 150,000 miles, but Frank knew the most important journey of his life was just beginning. After all, the best drivers understood that the destination mattered less than the determination to keep moving forward, and Frank Martinez had plenty of road left to travel. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.